Hello, everybody. Welcome to DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. My name is Brandon Adams, fresh out of the shower, hair slicked back, but ready to go for another edition of our program. We've got Connor Raleigh here coming up in just a moment. I want to set the scene, though, for today for a couple of things. Obviously, a lot of what we're going to do is going to be draft-related, going back to last night, what did happen for Andrew Thomas, Isaiah Wilson, what hasn't happened as of yet for Georgia running back DeAndre Swift. We will cover all of that. We're going to have some fun with a Scott Cochran tweet that has made Alabama fans very, very upset. We will deal with that over the course of our program. And I want to have a brief look ahead to what next year's draft might look like, at least when it comes to one position group in particular, because I think there's another angle to the Swift story from last night that needs to be explored a little bit more. So it's going to be a busy edition of our program. We're happy to have you with us for all of it. Let me also say a big thanks to our friends at Kroger, not just for being a sponsor of our show, but the great work they're doing in the community with their COVID-19 response fund as a part of the Kroger Company's Zero Hunger, Zero Waste Foundation. They're requesting customer donations right now at checkout through the month of April here, and you can kind of contribute to the COVID-19 emergency fund through Kroger. The way you can do that is you can kind of round up your purchase to the nearest dollar. Who's going to miss that money, right? Or you can make $1, $5, $10 donation, and you can help support Kroger's Zero Hunger, Zero Waste Foundation's COVID-19 relief fund. You know, when I go into Kroger these days, that's a lot. I'm always impressed by how clean the store is, how well stocked the shelves are, how hard the people have been working to make the experience of having food on my table go well. And obviously, as a way of showing thanks to Kroger, supporting a great relief effort they're a part of for COVID-19 is a great way to do that. So when you stop by your Kroger store, you can do that. Just round up your purchase to the nearest dollar, or make $1, $5, or $10 donation. With that said, here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger, let me bring in our buddy Connor Raleigh. Great reporting last night at DawgNation.com on the NFL draft. I know we joked about this, Connor, a bit on our Cover 4 broadcast going back Thursday afternoon. This is one of your sort of favorite days in the sports calendar no matter what, and the fact that it's the only date currently on the sports calendar probably made it even more enjoyable last night, right?
Yeah, the joke that I used yesterday was, I'm usually like a kid on Christmas when the NFL draft rolls around, but this is like having two really wealthy parents get divorced and then they get remarried, so you get two Christmases. It was sort of a double just because of the whole lack of sports and also it being one of my favorite events throughout the year.
So let me start with the first Georgia player who was taken. I think the story here is kind of interesting because there was not a lot of tipped hands about Andrew Thomas going number 4 overall to the Giants. If anything, there was a lot of media talk of other tackles being rated ahead of him. And yet I think you and I would both say that Thomas is about as bulletproof of pick as seemingly you can have. He's seemingly a really good dude off the field. He's obviously been a very good player for Georgia for 3 years on the field. What do you make of the fact that he kind of quietly worked his way into the top 4, becoming the highest ever offensive lineman drafted in the history of the Georgia program? He's got robber baron wealth now for his family for generations to come. How does all this go about, you think?
Yep. No, I'm just recalling back to our Cover 4 yesterday. Thomas was always the safest, lowest, or highest floor prospect among the tackles, and I actually think that ended up making him sort of most appealing to the New York Giants there at number 4. Dave Gettleman, I think, pretty clearly likes what he sees from Georgia football players. Second year in a row, they take a Georgia football player in the first round. They took DeAndre Baker in the first round last year. Lorenzo Carter was also a relatively high draft pick there for the Giants back in 2018. Thomas, again, I think the biggest thing with him, he, unlike guys like Tristan Wirfs and Jedrick Wills, those guys had really only played right tackle. Thomas has the versatility of showing on his college tape that he could play both right tackle and left tackle at an extremely high level. And I think ultimately that, along with everything else he brings, the off-field intangibles, the character, leadership values, I think that just made him one of the safer picks of the night. And when you're drafting a position like offensive tackle, it's really not a place you want to bust. That's a place where, you'd be okay with just a good solid player there. And I think that's exactly what Thomas is going to be at the next level.
Fun to see Wilson get into the first round there as well. There had been a lot of chatter about that in recent days. In fact, one of the teams that was pegged to draft him was the team that did select him, the Tennessee Titans. And just kind of given the way that Wilson's career path has kind of traveled to Georgia, I've spoken about this before, I have always kind of found Wilson to be among the more interesting players on the Georgia roster. And once again, you've really done it right if you get a chance to be one of the first 32 players selected what a great moment from him last night, and really unbridled emotion. The tears were flowing. It was a cool thing to be able to see last night.
Yeah, there were some people, Mel Kiper Jr., chief among them, who said Wilson should have gone back for another year at Georgia, and then he doubled down on that position last night when Wilson was taken in the first round. I thought that was pretty puzzling and, quite frankly, a little unprofessional there, just sort of raining on Wilson's parade there for a bit. But, yeah, great moment for Wilson, a guy who I think really, bet on himself in this draft process, was confident in what he had put on tape. He told us at the Combine that he had been matching up against guys who were going to be first-round picks, guys who were older than him, and he was holding his own. And that's sort of when he knew that he'd be ready for this next level. And the reality is, and this is the reason he was a 5-star recruit, there just are not that many players with his size and athleticism combination. And he's still, fairly raw in the game of football. He's not as polished as Thomas. But you give him time, especially on a good team like the Titans, where, right now he's not going to be asked to play left tackle. He's going to ask to be slotted in at that right tackle spot for the Titans. He's a mauler. He fits, I think, perfectly with what Tennessee wants to do on offense. They're a power rushing team with Derrick Henry. And over the course of the game, they want to wear you down. Well, Isaiah Wilson, over the course of the game is going to wear you down as a right tackle. And I think that's really a perfect fit for player and team.
It was also really funny to see, there was a lot of this last night on draft night, Wilson in particular, where it seemed like, maybe somebody was trying to work their way into the camera frame there a little bit, and somebody in the situation tried to, move that person out of there. There was a lot of managing the camera scene last night, virtual draft, who gets to be on the camera shot, who gets to have that moment next to the player as he's drafted. There were a lot of mamas who seemed to have some opinions about that last night, Isaiah Wilson included, I guess.
Yeah, Wilson's girlfriend wanted, I guess, a little extra screen time, and I guess Mrs. Wilson showed off where her son gets that elite push-pull ability, just yanking her right out of the way there. If NFL teams had seen that, I think before he had been drafted, maybe Wilson goes a little bit higher in the first round last night.
Yeah, you may be right about that. So I want to ask you this as a way of leading into something that I have talked to our podcast audience more about today, and we're going to have some fun with on video as well. So when it comes to Wilson and Thomas, do you foresee a tug of war here in terms of who gets credit for this? Sam Pittman, who coached them, Georgia, the program that housed them. Do you foresee any Cold War between what Pittman's going to try to say about this and what Georgia's going to try to say about this, about who ultimately gets the credit for the development that these two guys underwent while they were at UGA?
No, because I think in this circumstance, it is fair to say both these guys get credit and both deserve, I think, credit. Sam Pittman obviously did a fantastic job at Georgia, developing offensive linemen, recruiting them, building them up, bringing them in, and sort of making Andrew Thomas and Isaiah Wilson what they are. But Kirby Smart deserves the same, I think, amount of credit there. And I don't have a problem with if Pittman wants to hang pictures of Thomas and Wilson on his wall like he did sort of with Frank Ragnow when he was with Arkansas. I don't have an issue with that. It's not quite the Tim Brewster, Scott Cochran. These are guys who I coached at another school. Let me see if I can shoehorn my new school into this. I think this is a totally different situation. And if Pittman absolutely deserves some credit here for what he did with Thomas and Wilson and all the Georgia offensive linemen.
So speaking of Cochran's got the tweet out there. We're showing a lot of players that played at Alabama, and the Twitter edit, the way it's directed towards recruits, is essentially a way of Cochran kind of giving Georgia seemingly some credit for some players that played at Alabama. The honest truth is, I don't necessarily like stuff like this, but the fact that it makes Alabama fans so mad makes me love it, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
As an act of trolling, it's an A+, it's a 12 on a scale of 1 to 10. Would I advise a Georgia coach to typically do something like that? Probably not. But if Alabama fans are this mad about it, then something must be going well here.
This feels like Tim Brewster material, and Georgia doesn't need a Tim Brewster. Scott Cochran's reputation is well known and well established as one of the best developers of talent and developers of people in the country. He doesn't need some fancy graphic of guys who didn't play at Georgia or who never did anything to Georgia except beat them on the football field to sort of, help sell himself to possible recruits. So I wasn't exactly thrilled to see that out there. And whatever flack comes from this, I think is actually pretty deserved.
So let me defend it for a second. And I don't 100% disagree with you, but I want to play the other side of this for a moment. And I think there's actually an interesting tie-in to Sam Pittman on this. You mentioned Tim Brewster, who sort of famously put a big graphic together that featured Jalen Ramsey. Ramsey kind of shot back on that, feeling like he didn't want to have his name connected to Texas A&M. The reason why Scott Cochran in this case is not Tim Brewster, what he did as a part of the Aggies program is, there's not, and my prediction on this anyway is, there's not a single Alabama player featured on that graphic who will kind of fire back at Scott Cochran for using their name because they like Cochran. We've had former Alabama players on our show who've talked about how much they like Cochran. In the sort of battle of Nick Saban versus Scott Cochran, there are more former Alabama players kind of siding on the Cochran part of this than siding on the Saban part of this, so therefore that won't happen. It's the same thing if Sam Pittman tried to take credit for Thomas and Wilson. The truth is, Thomas and Wilson would not complain if their pictures showed up on an Arkansas graphic because they also like Pittman. So from the Cochran stance here, what makes it different than some of the carnival barking we've seen from Tim Brewster is the players whose likenesses is being used by Cochran. Seemingly, my prediction is they're more than okay with that because they like Cochran.
That's certainly a fair point. I still just think, and they probably when they put it together thought it was pretty innocuous, but that's not something I think the Georgia football program sort of needs to use to sort of sell itself to recruits. They've had a pretty strong reputation of developing players on their own. So I get why Cochran would want maybe that out there, but I just don't necessarily know if this was the best time for it.
Let me get into the DeAndre Swift stuff because obviously that was a huge topic last night. Swift does not go in the first round. That was not necessarily unforetold. We had sort of seen some mock drafts that had him out of the first round as we got later into the process here. And Connor, what I spent a lot of time on our podcast talking about on Thursday is that pretty much every draft pick, potential draft pick, all says the same stuff. They all talk about how hard they work. They all talk about how motivated they are. In Swift's case, when you're not drafting the first round, they all talk about how intense they are about vanquishing those that said they weren't good enough. And yet, when DeAndre Swift's case, he's just always had this veneer of believability. When he says that he's going to remember the people who passed over him, in Swift's case, it just seems like he probably will do that. He just comes across as very believable. I like that edge to him. I'm not surprised that he responded with a little bit of an edge last night as not being one of the first 32 selected. I thought it was cool to see Malik Herring and Jamar Salyer and McCole Hardman and others who've kind of stepped up and supported him. Honestly, none of this is a perfect science. Who knows who the best running back's going to truly be? But what did you make of Clyde Edwards-Helaire going to the Chiefs instead of DeAndre Swift?
It made sense to me. I think Edwards-Helaire fits what Andy Reid really wants in a running back in his offense, where, I think Swift, as good as he is as a pass catcher, he's as equally capable as a running back in what he's able to give you between the tackles. Whereas I think Edwards-Helaire is a better pure pass catcher than Swift, and I think that's just what the Chiefs want and value in a running back. And again, I think just about every NFL draft expert would agree with you. If they were just drafting the 32 best players, DeAndre Swift would have had his name called last night. But, what the reality is of running back these days and the production you're able to get from guys taken lower and later on in the draft, there's not that much of a need to take a guy like Swift in that first round, to pay him a little bit more money, to have that extra year of control with him. But I made this point in my story this morning. The number 1 and number 2 leading rushers in the NFL last year were both second-round picks. Yeah. That was Derrick Henry and Nick Chubb. So I expect Swift to be one of, I think, the first 15 names off the board tonight. I certainly think he could be drafted by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at pick number 45, and that'd be a great spot for him. Miami picks once again at pick number 39. It looked like he was going to go in the first round of Miami last night, and then the Packers inexplicably traded up to draft Jordan Love for reasons that are unbeknownst to me, given they have Aaron Rodgers there. But I think Swift is going to be a very, very good player very, very early on in his time in the NFL. I expect him to be probably a better player over the course of his career than Clyde Edwards-Helaire. But I think for what Edwards-Helaire is able to bring to the Chiefs, I certainly understand the reasoning of them going him there at the end of the first round.
One of the things that you and I have gone round and round on in the past is the impact that Joe Brady had on the LSU offense. I just think it's a fascinating sports story because it's very hard to find an example of like an A/B test like this almost all the same players in 2018, almost all the same players in 2019, and yet the results were so different. A lot of times we focus in on how much better Joe Burrow got from one year to the other. But the truth is the impact on the stats for Clyde Edwards-Helaire in a Joe Brady offense was almost just as significant, even though Brady was just the passing game coordinator. He goes from about 1,000 yards one year, second leading rusher, to being 1,400 yards, I believe, this most recent year. Huge, eye-popping type stats. And Connor, I guess it's a reminder to me of if you've got the right offensive coordinator in place, how much, even an enhanced passing game, how much running backs can kind of benefit from that. I think that's the untold story in all of this. I don't think there's any way. I mean, as amazing it is that Joe Burrow went from where he was projected after the 2018 season to the number 1 overall pick, the fact that Helaire went from being a backup running back at LSU to a first-round pick, that to me is almost just as substantial a leap. And I think it shows you what coaching can do to benefit a running back. And frankly, honesty compels me to admit it also kind of shows you how a talent like Swift can be maybe underrated if he didn't have the right kind of offense built around him.
Right. I think it's certainly fair to wonder, if Swift got to play in an LSU type offense, or even, I think back to a guy he's compared himself to, a Christian McCaffrey type offense at Stanford and his sort of last years in college. It wouldn't have surprised me to see him go in the top 15, top 20 of the draft, but because he just did not have that luxury this past year at the University of Georgia, that I do think certainly plays an impact on his stock and where he ended up getting drafted. It's interesting about Edwards-Helaire. You mentioned him, and obviously he had a better statistical year under Brady in that entire offense. But when he played against Georgia, he actually had a much better day in 2018 against the Bulldogs than he did in 2019, over 145 yards in that 2018 game, whereas I believe he had less than 60 in the SEC championship this past year. So he had always been, at least when I had seen him, an impressive football player. But I think to your larger point, when you have an entire offense opened up, it just makes things so much, and you're not necessarily putting it all on one guy like I think Georgia was doing with Swift this past year. I think it just makes everything so easy for a player like Edwards-Helaire, a player like Justin Jefferson to sort of shine when the opposing defense really can't key in on you. And I think that's a big reason you saw those guys go where they did last night.
You've said you expect DeAndre Swift to be an early pick in the second round. I would agree with you. The other interesting name here, whether it be second round or whatever, is Jake Fromm. I told Mike Griffith on the show yesterday that I really, even though I love the hot takes and the opinions, I really don't have a very well-formed opinion on where I think Jake Fromm is going to go, just because the projections I've heard have been so all over the place. Do you have any sense, or in the research that you've done, have you seen a consensus form that maybe I haven't noticed?
I do think Jake's going to have to wait a while to hear his name called tonight. I think he's going to be at best a third-round selection. But, it's not the end of the world. There have been some good players who come out of the third round and make, and have lasting NFL careers. I think the Indianapolis Colts at pick number 75, I think, is a really interesting spot for him. I think the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at pick number 76 could be an interesting spot for him, given just sort of the climates those two teams play in. They're both offensive-minded coaches. They're a place where he can go in, not be expected to start right away, but can sort of learn as a backup, be a quality backup to guys who are a little bit older. And then when those guys move on, they will have a guy who is ready to sort of step in and handle things right away. It would not. So this is, if I could give my best Mike Griffith hot take, bold prediction here, if I were going to place bets on where guys were going, if I could do a little parlay and put money on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers drafting both DeAndre Swift and Jake Fromm tonight, I'd put a little interesting nugget there, because I think there might be some decent odds on that happening.
That's very interesting. And obviously Georgia fans would love the idea of those two guys teaming back up again. I guess let me ask you this, because one of the comps that I've seen for Fromm as of late is kind of a weird one. The name Chase Daniels come up a couple of times, of course, a former Missouri quarterback, a guy that's been a long time back in the NFL and has made a ton of money for doing so. And it's a weird thing, Connor, because I'm not quite so sure how Georgia fans would process that, how I personally would process that. If you make as much money as Daniel has made, hard not to call yourself a football success story, and yet Daniel has played very little and may never play. What would you think of Fromm if he goes on to be kind of a well-paid career backup, the way that Chase Daniel is going to parlay that with his NFL career?
It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. I actually looked this up yesterday. Chase Daniels made $35 million
crazy
as a backup quarterback. He's a guy who, is a smart, capable guy. Maybe not a guy you turn to for 6, 7, 8, 9 starts a year. But if, a quarterback goes down and you need a guy who can fill in for you for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, he's certainly a guy that can do that. He's had plenty of suitors. He's played for a lot of great teams and a lot of great offensive-minded coaches. And I think if Fromm goes in sort of a situation where he's asked to do the same and maybe he never puts it together as an NFL-level starter, I certainly think that is something Fromm is capable of doing. And I'd be more surprised if he ends up washing out of the league than he did if he followed sort of that Chase Daniels career path.
Real quick final thing here. Beyond that, I know you watched the draft closely going into the weekend. What are the other UGA-related stories that are kind of interesting to you, whether it be Rodrigo getting selected, a lot of kickers don't, or other guys kind of sneaking into the draft here at some point in time? What's the rest of the weekend look like from a UGA perspective?
Yeah, on Saturday, I think there are a lot of fringe guys who might go undrafted, might get drafted. Some of them might prefer to go undrafted because there you actually get a little bit better of a choice of where you get to go in your situation. And that might give you a better shot of making the roster as opposed to just being a generic 7th-round pick. I expect J.R. Reed to have his name called in the 5th or 6th round. I would expect Solomon Kinley to hear his name in that same sort of round. Rodrigo, end of the 6th round, early 7th round. I do think he's going to get drafted as a kicker. I think he's made too many big kicks over the course of his career, as well as what he's able to bring as a kickoff guy and also as a marketing sort of ploy. I do think an owner could potentially find that pretty interesting, just given his popularity with Georgia, and he'd certainly be one of the more popular players in his new spot. And then you've got guys like Tyler Clark, Brian Harry, Lawrence Cager, Charlie Warner, Eli Wolf, guys who I believe if they go to the right team in the right situation, they could stick around in the NFL and sort of help a team out in a variety of roles. It's just going to be, can they ultimately find or get put in that right spot for them that will best maximize their skill sets.
Connor, great stuff. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll look forward to reading a bunch from you over the weekend. Of course, talk to you back on our program again very soon as well.
Yep, always great to be on with you, BA.
Nice stuff there from Connor Riley. By the way, speaking of our friends at Kroger, as I mentioned before, I know so many of you are cooking a lot more at home than you've ever cooked before. And let's face it, sometimes you sort of get tired of the same old. Well, Kroger's got you taken care of when you're doing that. Meal inspiration, you may find that you need it right now. How about some videos, step-by-step instructions from our friends at Kroger about how you can do some delicious dinner options for you and your family? Visit Kroger.com/recipes for more on that. It's Kroger.com/recipes for some really, really delicious food that you can kind of fall in love with. So we can talk draft stuff if you want to. We can kind of get more into the Scott Cochran stuff if you want to. As I said before, I don't necessarily love that kind of stuff from Georgia. That's a gimmick that I don't think that Georgia necessarily needs. However, if it makes Alabama fans mad, then I'm certainly entertained by it. And as I said before, I think the players from Bama used by Cochran for an edit like that, I think they're not very likely to complain about it because they personally like Cochran. And in stories like these, that kind of matters. And don't discount the fact that one of the reasons why there's so much animosity right now, not just on the basis of fan versus fan, but institutionally over Cochran, that factor probably plays a role in this too. Saban knows how popular Cochran was with current and former Alabama players, and there's an awareness about that. So kind of keep that in mind. All right, let's get some Facebook and YouTube comments. I'll do Facebook first, then I'll do some YouTube, and then we'll kind of roll into the weekend after that on what was a really fun post-draft day here on our program. Looks like Mary Martin Corbin kind of weighing in on Jake Fromm here, so a lot of talk on Fromm here. Richard Pollard says, I was not a fan of that image. I understand where some Georgia fans kind of come down on that too. As I said before, it's a little more gimmicky than you think Georgia probably needs to use. And I guess the weird part of all of this is, I've said this a million times, programs do all this kind of stuff for recruiting, but ultimately I don't think anyone ever chooses a school on the basis of social media edit. I just don't. I think these kinds of edits kind of show up in timelines much the same way. You know how like when you're on Twitter or Instagram, whatever you're on, like the promoted tweet shows up and you just sort of scroll right on by it. These kind of flashy things sometimes I don't think really resonate and hit home the way that you might think they do. It's really the relationships that matter more than anything else. That's what Smart and his staff have been so good at leveraging. And ultimately, I believe that Cochran's going to be a really good recruiter too. And it's going to be those relationships that he's just authentically capable of connecting with. They're going to help him in recruiting there as well. So the funny part of all of this is, is the symbolic nature of some of these tweets and edits and things like that. I don't think they probably impact recruiting all that much. A few more here on Facebook, then we'll go to YouTube. Kathy Aquavia Green says folks will never agree on Jake Fromm, and ultimately that's probably one of the truest things that could be said in our comment section. Whether it be Georgia fans who've watched every snap that he's ever taken, or kind of the scouting media, analysts with the NFL Network, analysts with ESPN, just draft guy with social media following. The opinions on Fromm will always be really, really split. It's one of the reasons why sometimes the quarterback conversation around here last couple of years got really, really maddening, because in addition to kind of being sometimes a split decision, people also almost took it like a political thing, where once you were in your corner on this, you could not acknowledge anything that, whether it be pro-Fromm or anti-Fromm, you couldn't really acknowledge the other side of this at all. There was really very little room for nuance on all of this, and the presence of Fields only made that more complicated. It's frustrating, because I'm the kind of guy that you see what we're doing right now. We're just sort of shooting from the hip. We're freewheeling here. I love that. And when it came to the Fromm conversation, there was just not a lot of room for just sort of speaking about the good, the bad, and everything in between. Sometimes the conversation just got too intense. So obviously Georgia fans wish him well and are cheering for him, but it is kind of interesting just how polarized that conversation become. I don't think Kathy's wrong about that. Winston Mock asked a good question. Has Mullen ever had an offensive player taken in the first round? Has he? Did he have a receiver a couple of years ago? That's a pretty good question. Pretty good question. Let's get a few more here on Facebook. David Gross with a funny line on Facebook. That's pretty funny. Bob Garrison on the subject of the Falcons. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, Kinlaw was almost going to fall to them. San Francisco scoops up and grabs him again. On the tombstone of failed GMs, one of the things that you will see as an epitaph is he drafted for need. As much of a sort of a cardinal sin as trading up in a draft can be, drafting for need is another one of those. The best GMs over the course of the long haul are just going to take the best player available regardless of position. Now, Atlanta really needed a cornerback, and that's probably some roster deficiencies that led to that being such a glaring need. But over the course of multiple years, drafting for need as opposed to collecting the best talent you can, that is not a recipe for success. So I was not very happy with Atlanta's draft last night. But given that sort of no man's land where they were picking at 16th, I'm not really quite sure who I wanted them to take there. But it's just so devastating that Kinlaw was off the board. The chance to get Atlanta won a lot of meaningless games late in the season that really prohibited them from getting the kind of game-changing player that could have altered the franchise the way that a Kinlaw potentially could, a Derek Brown potentially could have, obviously a Chase Young, if you really up near the front of the draft, could have. It's just a shame to see Atlanta, and there's nothing wrong with Terrell here. He may be a good player, but, the idea that's going to somehow alter the fortunes of your organization, I don't necessarily see it that way. I don't. A couple more on Facebook, then we're over to YouTube. Daniel Aldridge says, glass man to the Dolphins. I guess that's a reference to Tua Tagovailoa. As I said yesterday, do not discount the fact that for a team like Miami, who probably already like Tua, the fact that he's hurt makes them like him even more. Because you've got analysts on TV last night saying, no, you got to play Ryan Fitzpatrick quarterback this year. You got to give Tua Tagovailoa the time that he needs to fully recover, to fully develop. That helps a team like Miami on two fronts. On the one hand, there's no pressure to prove how good your draft pick was right away. That sort of helps the organization kind of save some face in the event that there's a slow start. And some, even quarterbacks who go on to succeed, have slow early starts. And for these teams that are openly trying to acquire as much draft capital as possible, the same way that NBA teams do this for a number of years, Miami was clearly in that mold, or in that mode, going back to last season. This is another chance to kind of, there was tank for Tua, now there's tank with Tua. Don't discount that. If you watch the Last Dance Bulls documentary on Sunday, early Jordan career, limited to about, what they say, 7 minutes a quarter or a half or whatever it was, because they were trying to protect his injury and also trying to keep from making the playoffs, although I think they eventually made the playoffs that year. The point is, teams can't openly admit to tanking, but it's obvious in the NFL some teams are. And Miami, I think, was one of them at one point in time, although it's kind of hard to do at the NFL level. But either way, having a quarterback who you believe will eventually be healthy, who may not be healthy enough to play at the very beginning of the season, that's a pretty easy, interesting way to kind of work yourself into a tanking situation. Dolphins can't admit that. Most of the TV analysts can't even give voice to that because the NFL doesn't want to hear it. But don't discount that being part of the Tua Tagovailoa story. Green Soldier says coaching is everything. And I guess that's kind of the point that I kind of got into with Connor. And I'm going to write more about this weekend. I'm going to talk more about this in the podcast edition of our show here today. There is an aspect of DeAndre Swift falling to the second round that puts even more of a spotlight on what Georgia was not doing with its offensive game plan a year ago. It was a failed game plan. It's the reason why James Coley was fired, and it's the reason why Todd Monken was brought in. And I'm not necessarily all that interested in rehashing what went wrong for Georgia a year ago, but when you have a winning game plan, it's clear that not just your quarterback benefits from that. Big-time passing attack, that's not just quarterbacks and wide receivers. That's also big, wide running lanes for Clyde Edwards-Helaire to run through. It's also Edwards-Helaire becoming a major factor in that passing attack a season ago. And when you look ahead, if Todd Monken has the kind of impact that he can have at Georgia, as the Green Soldier, I think, is alluding to here, that's not only something that Jamie Newman and George Pickens and Dominic Blaylock can thrive in, but for Zamir White. And as many have said, how about James Cook, the versatility that he brings to the table? Freshman Kendall Milton, Kenny McIntosh, Dejon Edwards to a certain extent. These running backs can also find themselves in a much more advantageous position there as well. Coaching does matter. Joe Brady, the impact that he made at LSU, has made Joe Burrow and now Clyde Edwards-Helaire a very, very rich man. And a similar impact from Monken, even if the stats don't quite match up, because honestly, that'd be asking for a lot. But if the impact is similar in terms of the transformation that occurs, then it could be very, very good for Georgia players. And that next generation of Georgia running back in the draft might not have to wonder, hey, how come I fell out of the first round? That just may not be an issue in future Georgia draft discussions. Let's see what else is going on here. James Wade mentions a really interesting point. First of all, how about Henry Ruggs being the first receiver off the board? The Raiders have always kind of valued that speed. Certainly Ruggs has got that in just, limitless supply. And as James Wade brings up, y'all know, I've joked about this 1,000 times. I love the videos of football players dunking. Let me tell you something. There ain't no, and I use bad grammar intentionally, there ain't no football players basketball highlights that look more impressive than what Henry Ruggs put together. There's a video on social media. It's been shared like 8 gazillion times of Ruggs in the middle of games, just in the flow of the game, just dunking all over people, blocking shots off the backboard. I mean, I don't even know how many high school basketball players, like true basketball first guys, have better basketball highlights than this Ruggs thing that's going around. It looks insane. It's such a beautiful show of athleticism. You got to find it. I don't have it. I'd show it to you if I did. But this Ruggs basketball highlight tape is ridiculous. Ridiculous. I'm glad somebody brought that up. CB also mentioned the fact that Terrell had a really bad game against his best competition this past year. LSU didn't exactly perform well. Not a great game against Ohio State. And I'm going to tell you, that's not a good sign. I kind of agree on that. It's not a good sign. Not a good sign. Jay Shipe says now that Tua is at Miami, is his brother going to transfer to one of those other Florida programs? I certainly don't think that, is it Talia, is that how you say it, Talia Tagovailoa? I don't think he's in the Alabama future quarterback plans. I don't think he's got a spot there in terms of actually getting on the field anytime soon. So an eventual transfer, maybe so. A lot of people have made mention of the fact that Tua didn't seem, and the family didn't seem all that happy about being drafted by the Dolphins last night. The honest truth is I don't really know what to make about that. It seemed to my eyes, watching these Skypes or whatever they were from inside the families' homes, that so many of them were on delay, that you weren't getting a lot of those really emotional moments. You got a good one from Isaiah Wilson, but you weren't really getting a lot of emotional moments from the other folks because somehow, I can tell you this. So when we're doing this show right here, me at my home, Michael Carvel's our producer. He's at his home. You know how we like to use a lot of graphics on the show, and we've got some capabilities for doing that. You know, since we've been doing the show from home, I'm not using as many graphics during the show because everything's so delayed. And so Michael's good enough to like show like a Scott Cochran tweet on the screen, or he'll show, you know, Andrew Thomas, Isaiah Wilson sort of celebrating after they get drafted. But I can't see that at all, because by the time I see that on my screen, because I don't have a monitor the way that I do in my regular studio, and I promise I'm going somewhere with this. When we're in our regular studio, I have a monitor, so I'm seeing what you're seeing in real time. But at my home, I'm not seeing that. Everything's delayed. And in some cases, it's delayed by as much as 10 or 15 seconds in some scenarios. And I'm imagining ESPN probably dealt with some of that same stuff last night. When you've got these video feeds, not satellites, but true like streaming video feeds going on, there's a bunch of delay going on. And I'm guessing that a lot of what we saw from the families in terms of celebrating the draft picks, I'm guessing a lot of that was just not necessarily real time, and not necessarily the same kind of like unbridled emotion you would have gotten had they been sitting there at the Bellagio riding that boat in Las Vegas the way they initially thought they were going to be. So that's kind of, I guess, sort of my take on that. Let's do a few more YouTubes here. See what else people are talking about. Michael Porter says, any clue where Swift lands? We certainly heard Connor Raleigh a moment ago touting Tampa Bay as a potential landing spot for him, which sounds about as, I guess, good as anything to me right now. So that was certainly Connor's pick, and I don't have anything more informed than that. I mean, I still think there's a chance that Atlanta could consider running back, even though they did sign Todd Gurley. Does he wait that long to go? I could see Atlanta potentially considering another running back. There's also the second round is going to be loaded with running backs. Almost for sure, J.K. Dobbins goes in the second round. DeAndre Swift goes in the second round. Jonathan Taylor goes in the second round. That's three there. There are others as well. So one of the big stories of the second round is going to be running backs. You could see it run on some quarterbacks more too. You know, the possibility of Eason, maybe Jalen Hurts. You may see some of that kind of stuff. Green Soldier says the NFL is boring to him. And I've always said before, I'm a much bigger college football fan than NFL fan. But last night, man, I thought this was a welcome change to our typical routine. Not just in terms of there's not much sports on, but I think lately we've all been so unfortunately held hostage by cable news, and you know, whatever sort of brand of cable news you choose. I think many times we would all admit that, you know, sometimes the presence of that during something as, you know, complicated and you know, anxiety producing as the coronavirus has been, the presence of cable news doesn't always make things better, if you know what I'm saying. And that's true no matter which network you prefer. So last night, I thought it was just kind of nice to have that sort of stranglehold that cable news has had on so much of our society kind of loosened a bit. And you sort of wonder if after the big draft, I'm sure it's going to get huge ratings, and the conversation is going to continue through the weekend. You sort of wonder if this step was not an important step towards kind of getting us sort of off that virus footing, where that's, you know, like the thing that the only thing that anyone's talked about for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. It's obviously a serious topic, but the sort of like endless obsession with it, you know, may not necessarily make us better off in the long run. So from that standpoint, I was really glad to see the draft talk last night. I know that Roger Goodell is not typically a very popular person. He's famous for getting booed, and there was even kind of a virtual booing of Goodell last night. But I think Goodell's leadership to all of this has been commendable. I thought what he said last night in terms about the role that the NFL plays and the search for optimism and just the role of a distraction that it plays in our society, that was all very well said. Certainly a well-intended message on Goodell's part. I think we owe him a debt of gratitude. I think the act of getting college football on the field in the fall was made easier by the NFL going first last night. There's absolutely zero health reasons why this league could not have held that virtual draft. There were a lot of GMs, personnel men, both on and on the record, who whined incessantly about it, and Goodell simply ignored them. It was the right thing to do, not just for his league, but for our country. It was cool to see sports back in a virtual sense last night. A couple more comments. Let's see what else is going on. Georgia and Olive says, didn't like the way the ESPN was negative in their commentary about Andrew Thomas. They were surprised he went number 4. And yeah, I mean, they got to give their takes. I mean, that, you know, for
if it's not a player that we have an emotional investment in, it's the actual, take that's going to be more interesting to most people of this guy was drafted too high, this guy was drafted too low, whatever else. That's the stuff that kind of becomes interesting. When it's your guy, in Thomas's case, you don't necessarily like that, but that's what those guys are kind of there to do. And clearly what matters is what the personnel people think. And obviously Andrew Thomas was very much loved because of that. Daniel Aldridge says, who thinks we're going to have Georgia football again very soon? Boy, I think we're well on our way to having that back very soon indeed. I think we're well on our way to a fall with football, and I love the idea of seeing that. Randy Hall on the subject of Javon Kinlaw. Amazing how many SEC guys are drafted. The two big numbers that I'm seeing a lot of chatter on right now, and they're I think both amazing on both fronts. The total number of SEC guys who are drafted is like half the first round or something crazy like that. And the overwhelming percentage of the players who were drafted were at least 4-star players coming out of high school, if not 5 stars. I've said before, the recruiting industry, the people who rate these players for a living, it's a hard job, it's a thankless job. But when it comes to like grouping guys in populations, they really get it right. Individual player, no one's going to bat 1,000 on that. That's about a 50-50 proposition. But putting them in groups. Here are the guys that we think are future first-round picks. Here are the guys that we think are going to play in the NFL. When it comes to grouping guys in populations, the recruiting industry does a very good job at that. I'm going to give them a ton of credit for that. Lynn Johnson Shipman mentioning J.R. Reed. That's going to be a fun one to watch. Reed's a guy that I think can certainly play in the NFL for sure. Phil Rogers asked about Dominic Blaylock. Kirby Smart had some complimentary words for Blaylock the other day that that they really, that process for him began before even the shutdown occurred. And so Smart kind of gave it a little bit of a hopeful tone on Blaylock recently, and I'll take that as pretty good news. Speaking of good news, fun news, make sure you check out AJC.com for your Atlanta news now. With what the Falcons did in last night's draft, the local products who've kind of made their way into NFL homes, and what's going to happen in the rest of the draft this weekend. Really good coverage from the AJC sports team there at AJC.com on that. You can also keep up with, the state in some form and fashion is reopening today. Some businesses are choosing to do that. Some are choosing to wait. Everyone exercising their freedom on that. But as you want to kind of follow along and kind of what's what, who's doing what is going to happen next, also a great way to stay up to date on that at AJC.com as well. Get your Atlanta news now at AJC.com. The serious stuff, the fun sports stuff, everything in between. A lot of draft stuff right now. Check out AJC.com for a lot more on that. Let me try to do one or two more comments, then after that we got to get ready to roll today. Billy Hurley says the beard may get drafted in the second round. Boy, Billy, I appreciate that. That's nice of you to say. John Shaw says, does Hot Rod get drafted? A lot of kickers don't. Most NFL teams treat kickers the same way you treat your fantasy draft. They sort of get everybody else, and the thing about kickers as of last. In Hot Rod's case, because he was so good at Georgia and because, he just kind of brings a sort of air of dependability around him, my guess is that Hot Rod has a very good chance of being drafted, but a lot of kickers who go on to long careers in the league do not get drafted. So, but he will be a guy that you're watching heading into Saturday, almost for sure. Let's see what else here. A couple more YouTubes. Stony Lid says he'd seen a mock draft that had Isaiah Wilson going in the fourth round. Yeah, Wilson, he bet on himself, and he got paid handsomely. I mean, think about, you get drafted in the first round, and I hate to say it this way, but it's true. Even if you don't go on to be a good player, your family is set up for generations. And he had people telling him he should have stayed in school. And as a Georgia fan, maybe you wish that he would have stayed in school because it'd be nice to have him. But the truth is, man, there is something. I love entrepreneurial spirit. I love guys who open businesses, who, challenge themselves to be the best they can be. And in Isaiah Wilson's case, this is the sort of entrepreneurial spirit at work within the sporting sense of, hey, most guys who leave early will regret it. There's only 32 spots for guys to go in the first round, and well more than 32 guys will leave school early. For some, it's just not going to work out. There's not enough, opportunity to go around. But Isaiah Wilson said, that's okay. I'm going to get my unfair share of the market here. I'm going to jump in here and be drafted in the first round. I think it's a great, great testament to his self-confidence, his development over the course of his time there at UGA. One of the real feel-good stories of the Kirby Smart era is Wilson going from a guy that was not playing in 2017 to being a first-round pick after the 2019 season. What a cool thing. Really appreciate all of you being here for DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger here today. I could talk to you all day long, but for now, we got to get ready for the podcast edition of our program, and I'll remind you that 1,273 days, that's how long it's been since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Our buddy Eddie loves that, and it's a great reminder for you. You're on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. You'll have a great weekend. Stay close to DawgNation for plenty of draft coverage, and you never know what fun and surprises may pop up. We'll look forward to talking to all of you back here again on Monday. DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. Have a great weekend, everybody.